If you've made it this far, thanks so much for listening to the podcast. We are supported by Projectile Warehouse. So if you guys could go over and check out their page, follow them on YouTube and all of the social medias, that would be fantastic. We are back with Steve Hurt from Outer Edge Projectiles. Thanks for coming on again. We wanted to follow up from what was a very interesting podcast last time. So we're just going to keep diving in. Mate, thanks for coming back.
Thank you. It's been a lot of fun so far, and I'm looking forward to the game.
Yeah, sweet. All right, well, we'll charge on. We sort of mentioned at the end of the last podcast that we were going to get you to step through basically your process on how you load, and also how you suggest other people load, and what the things are they need to find and establish before they start building a load. Not just specifically for copper projectiles,
but general
as well.
Yep.
If there are specifics that you feel like you do or need to do differently for your projectiles versus lead projectiles, then by all means point out those differences. But if you have a process that you do for both, walk us through that.
Well, generally speaking, the reloading process is pretty universal. Where major discrepancies or differences were perceived, those beliefs or paradigms are rapidly disappearing. So basically, in my view, the most important thing is to match your bullet to your barrel. You're not going to get good results if your bullet isn't stable. In our particular product, we label on the box and on all our information what barrel twist this particular bullet was intended for. Other manufacturers do it, some don't. But in my view, it is probably the most important place to start. So now that you've chosen your bullet based on your existing resources or where it is you want to go, that bullet selection now fixed, and that moves on to stage 2. And stage 2 is setting your jump to the lands. Now, jump to the lands is open to a lot of discussion and conjecture, but more and more science is being applied, and more testing and more measurement is being applied. And where we thought that the principles of a 40 to 60 thou jump, and I like to start at 50, was unique to copper, I've seen research conducted by others using conventional cup and core projectiles that have indicated that very similar results should be expected in the same process. So it's not that you can't get good results with much longer or much shorter jumps, but the most flexible, the most reliable and consistent results are going to be achieved, generally speaking, in that 40 to 60 thou jump. So I like to start at 50. So now the bullet has been matched to the barrel. Mm-hmm. You then have that bullet inserted into your case, set to that 50 thou magic mark to start with anyway. Now you have a fixed case capacity, right? Now you've got that fixed case capacity. You're not going around in circles chasing your tail by varying it by adjusting your jump to the lands. Once that case capacity is known, whether you're doing it by trial and error or calculation, it doesn't really matter. You're going to get to that ideal nodal point much more quickly if you're varying one variable at a time instead of two.
Yes. So what you're saying is, like, when people do quite often they'll do a powder depth charge or whatever, a powder level.
Yep.
Test, powder, like a ladder test.
Yep.
And they will also be changing seating depth at the same time. And what you're saying is you're actually changing the internal case capacity and pressure and volume by pushing the bullet either further in or further out.
And you're not actually achieving anything because you're changing two variables and you don't know what effect one is having in isolation. And the only way you can do that is to change one at a time.
So you'll start with a 50 thou jump number,
which is basically one. We'll call it 1.3 to 1.5 millimeter jump.
Yep. And then you will run a powder ladder test at that one seating depth. Find your flat spot in your node for your powder, and then once you've done that, is that when you then start playing with that little bit of variance in the seating depth?
No, Well, that is exactly what happens, but the next step down the track.
Yes. Okay.
The intermediate step in between is to prep your brass for consistency.
Yeah.
So you need to know your bump.
Yeah.
You need to know that the brass you're using is consistent and not variable. It all needs to be one brand, one batch if possible. And
which we see happen a lot. A lot of people have factory ammo that they've shot out in 3 different brands, and then they think, I'll just use all the brass and try and
they've all got different case capacities and wonder why they can't get consistent groupings. Hunters tend to do that more often than target shooters. But I think the other thing that at the next level is that some brands of brass, while they might be really consistent within the batch, may vary from batch to batch.
Okay.
Right. So it's important that if you have to move on to another batch, that you cross-reference and check it. Now, some brands of brass, particularly European brass, will often be extremely consistent from batch to batch, year to year. Absolutely wonderful, happy days. I've seen some batches of American brass that were actually really good within itself, but the next batch was different. And that's in and of itself not a disaster as long as you know.
Yeah.
Because you then have to recalibrate.
Yep. Yeah. So we had some questions on one of the info nights about how to best way to establish finding the measurement of the lands, where the lands are in your particular rifle. And it varied in ways to do that.
Yep.
Do you have a preferred method on how you do it?
Yes, I do. People use ogive comparators and all that kind of stuff. No, because our stuff is CNC turned, there is absolutely no point in doing that because it's so consistent. So the only ogive comparator we really use is the chamber.
Yeah. So you let the chamber and the bullet tell us
what the engagement is, and it's one of those things that you do have to be careful, and it's a little bit of experience and feel is involved, but you remove the pin, the firing pin.
Yep.
You're not using a loaded case, of course. There's no powder or primer in it, but you remove the firing pin and you remove the ejector pin and spring, because that can give you false readings, because it tends to the ejector pin applies pressure to the back of the head.
Yeah.
And there's a little bit of play, because if there wasn't a little bit of play or tolerance, you wouldn't be able to close a loaded cartridge into the chamber. So there's a little bit of slop there. So what you're basically looking to do is feed that consistently and not be introducing the variable of the the ejector pin and the spring.
Yep.
And a little bit of change of thickness in the brass head can give you distorted readings in that regard. Right?
Yeah.
So assuming that you've prepped your case, they're all the same length, and your dies have been set correctly. The firing pin, the ejector pin, and the spring have all been removed. You shoot the pill out too far.
Yep.
And you very carefully and gently close the bolt, and you're not going to be able to, but you want to know how close you are to be able to getting that bolt to reach the bottom of its stroke cycle, and just feel interference at the bottom of that cycle with just 2 fingers lightly applied. And this is obviously more challenging with VLD bullets than it is Stouter type hunting bullets.
Yeah.
But it's still possible to do. Now you know, once you've been through that process, and it's something it's easier to show than to talk about.
Yep.
But once that engagement is just sensed,
Yep.
now you know where it's kissing the lands.
Yep. So
from there, I then back it off a specified amount, which is normally, well, when I say 1.3, that's rounded. It's normally about 1.27 millimeters.
Yep.
That's my starting point.
Yep.
And sometimes I'll set it in just a little bit more.
Yep.
Because although a jump of 40 to 60 is the overwhelming majority of the time the ideal, I like to use 50 because it's smack in the middle of the zone. And if you start at 60 and get everything tickety-boo, the issue is that your throat's going to wear. Right? So it's better if you can start a little bit
further forward, so you got time for that throat to erode
Correct.
forward and it's still to shoot good groups. So for anyone that's listening that's sort of struggling to follow along, because you're right, if you see someone do it, it kind of makes a lot more sense. So essentially you've stripped the bolt out so that if you had no case, no bullet in there, you just run the bolt forward and your bolt will just drop down. It drops down into place because it's not.
If the brass is properly sized, that's exactly what will happen. Yeah,
and then you seat the projectile in that case out too long, so you know it's going to be way too long, and you find then you seat it a little bit more. You gently keep coming back.
And in the early stages, they might be quite big jumps, but toward the end, it's going to be very minute, very small.
And you'll find that difference between if you're not touching the lands at all, the bolt will still continue to fall all the way down and not have any force. But if you're just touching the lands, you'll feel that last. You can
feel that last little bit of resistance.
Yeah, little resistance as the bolt's falling. It'll catch as it's camming over and falling into place. It'll just catch a little bit.
And now you've got your reference marker.
Yep. And that's what you base your measurement
then
on.
You start pushing back from there.
And
you've got to remember there's a little bit of play there because you can use micrometers for small dimensions, but when you're talking about cartridge overall length, you end up using verniers. Mm-hmm. Well, they're only accurate to 0.01 plus or minus, so that's 0.02. There's a little bit of play there.
Yeah.
It's not that critical.
Yeah, well, I think that's something that we've spoken about you just need to find that starting point. And look, if the worst case scenario is you can't figure this concept out and you do use a Hornady overall case length gauge, so what? There is. It's not the ideal, but if you get yourself some sort of reference point for a starting number of base to the lands.
Now you've got a reference point to work forward
in
or
that
back
window
from.
of that 40 to 60 thou jump. This gets way more complicated, and like you said, there's guys shooting tiny little bug hole, one hole groups with the bullets jammed into the lands. That's fine. You can totally do that. People will do that and get very great results, but it gives you less wiggle room. So what you think could be a 5 thou jam might actually be a 15 thou jam.
Well, the other thing too about it is that that's fine for bench resters. They're in a different context. They've got access to much greater resources. If things don't go exactly to plan, the truck's behind them or the reloading room is in there and they can make adjustments. But when you're in the field, that's not going to happen. The other thing too is that when you have the bullet seated very close to the lands, in, near or around, with a very, very small jump, it's much less flexible to changes in atmospherics. So if the temperature increases or all sorts of a whole bunch of variables that change, a group that shot really well with a very, very tight tolerance, with a massive change in either temperature or the number of rounds fired or something along those lines, starts to become very, very sensitive. Or it can become very sensitive. But in that zone of between 40 and 60 thou, you find really good levels of accuracy and a much broader range of tolerance to atmospheric changes and conditions. The other thing too is that from a hunting perspective particularly, if you make a mistake and seat it too far out and jam the bullet into the lens for whatever reason, and it gets stuck when you go to eject the case, you've got a problem that's extremely challenging to address.
Yeah.
Because very few, if any, hunters that I know actually walk around with a cleaning rod in their backpack.
Yeah, to be able to push the projectile out.
So these are unacceptable. These are just absolutely and totally unacceptable possibility scenarios that must be avoided at all costs.
Yeah.
But have a little bit more. You're dancing closer to the edge in the bench rest situation, but you've also got more resources and ways of dealing with that you don't have in the bush.
Yeah. There's been a lot of research. I've referenced it here in the podcast quite a few times about bullet jump research and how they're finding that there is those longer jumps sometimes, like you're saying, give you that flexibility where everything from 40 thou. That window can be huge. It's 40 thou through to 70, and that everything in there shoots well. Whereas you load it 15 thou or 20 thou off the lands might be amazing, but then 25 thou, 30 thou are absolutely garbage.
Or even closer at 17 or 16. And
Yeah.
you're talking about a very much smaller margin.
Yeah, sometimes you can't run that kind of tolerance in your actual, seeding die.
Yeah, and of course that all becomes problematic from the perspective that with throat wear. And if you're using an uncoated bullet, for instance, there's some conjecture, but as a rough rule of thumb, you get about 5 thou of wear for every 100 bullets
Yeah, wow.
you're fired. So if your load is absolutely critically jump sensitive to the tune of plus or minus a couple of 3 or 4 thou at close with a closed jump, you'll find that you spend your whole life chasing the lands. Whereas if you're working in that 40 to 60 zone, then you have a much greater level of flexibility. You're not chasing the lands all the time. You're not reevaluating your loads all the time.
Yeah.
And we've come up with some incredibly precise results with these longer jumps. And the surprise to us is we thought this was unique to copper bullets.
Yeah.
But it's actually, we didn't do that much development work with jacketed lead bullets because it's not our market, but only to find that other people, other competitors have done the same sort of work.
Yeah.
And we looked at the results of both and went, oh, look at that.
Yeah. Well, and something I found interesting was like, if you look at the length of factory ammo, good factory ammo, let's take Hornady match ammo, is relatively decent factory ammunition.
Yeah.
In its intended purposes, your 6.5 Creed, your 6 Creed factory ammo, it shoots pretty well in most guns. Now they've had to do a lot of research to make that ammo because they don't know what gun it's going in. All they can base it off is a SAMI spec chamber, and so they've done so much research around, okay, we need this to work across not just one gun, but the broadest spectrum of guns possible. And I think you'll find when you measure those rounds,
they're all in that zone.
They're in that zone of 50 thou plus jump, sort of.
And you just don't have that flexibility when you're talking 15 off, 5 in, plus or minus 3. It just doesn't work.
No, and those bigger jumps, that factory ammo, you might shoot amazing in one rifle and kind of okay in another.
Yeah.
But very rarely does that high grade match factory ammo go, nah, my gun flat out will not shoot it. If it's twist rate dependent, if it's obviously
as long as you've matched the bullet to the barrel twist, that's generally true.
Yeah, it'll shoot pretty well. So now that we've sort of established the zone you want to be playing in for seeding depth, what's your process for? You've got an initial powder charge that you want to start with. What do you base that initial charge off of?
Well, because it's our product, we've had to go and do all the preliminary homework.
Yeah.
As opposed to somebody who's trying our product as an end user without any of the technical background behind them. So there's a number of ways you can go about doing it, but what we do, and we publish our load data, right? But load data is absolutely of no value unless you know the parameters. So, and by that I mean case capacity is a critically important one. When you look at some cartridges and brands of cartridges, there can be an enormous range of case capacity. So we actually nominate the cases that we used. So typically Lapua brass, which is outstanding quality, is ever so slightly lower in case capacity than, say, another brand. So we've done that in the 6.5 Creedmoor. We found that the case, and in the 308, and we found that the case capacity in the Lapua was slightly less than, say, the Hornady or the ADI or the Winchester. And that doesn't make it good, bad, right or wrong, but you do need to know what it is. All right. So if you're dealing with 54.4 grains of case capacity as opposed to 56, that's obviously going to have an influence on how much, where you start and where you finish. And another example of it too is that, and a really classic diabolical example was the old 300 Win Magnum. One brand of American brass had a case capacity of 88 grains of water, and one of the European brands was 95.6 or 7, which is it's a huge
percentage
variation
of that case.
And that doesn't mean to say that one would shoot and the other one wouldn't. What it means is if you mix those loads up and put without knowing, and
Yeah.
put the 98, put the 95.7, 98.
The charge that's in the bigger case.
And then put it in the 88 grain case, all of a sudden things go pear-shaped and you sit back scratching your head and wondering why.
What's going on, yeah.
So the first thing is really important is that you use the one brand of brass.
Yep.
Keep your batches consistent. Know what your case capacity is, and now you've got a benchmark to start experimenting with. So high quality, a minimum starting point is a good quality reloading manual. That's a minimum starting point. And you'll notice that the variations are often quite wide because they'll nominate, say, brand A of brass, but 5 years ago, the case capacity in this particular batch was X, but now it's Y.
Yeah.
And the other thing that influences what your minimum and maximum is the temperature at which you're going to be hunting. And the reloading manuals and the factory ammunition manufacturers have absolutely no idea whether you're hunting in the snow in the Alps or in just to the east of Arnhem Land chasing buffalo. They've got no idea where you're going to be. So they have to come up with a load
It's going to fit
that's
safely
going to be safe at
those.
both ends of the equation. So it becomes a one-size-fits-all scenario, which is limiting to ultimate performance, but generally good enough. And their first and foremost requirement is that it's safe.
Yeah.
The second requirement, of course, then becomes all the consequential performance issues. And you can narrow those down and fine-tune them as a reloader, but you've got to start with the metrics of what's the case capacity, what's the influence of the seating depth on that case capacity. And then in our case, we start with a particular brand of brass nominating the case capacity, and then we say on our website, if you're using a different brand of brass, please measure your case capacity, and if it varies significantly to what we use, we will recalibrate your load for you.
Oh, wow.
Right?
Yeah.
Because it's in our interest to keep
everyone safe.
Keep everybody safe and get them
because
the
just
best
so
performance.
people know, something I didn't realise either, like not to stop you, but just jump in on this, is that low pressure can be very, very dangerous as well.
It can be,
and I didn't realise that. But if you are under pressure, because you need a certain amount of pressure to get that bullet up and moving and out of the barrel, and if it doesn't move far enough, it only jumps in and doesn't have enough oomph behind it to keep it going down the barrel, it stops. You get what do they call it, secondary ignition and things like that? Or
they're kind of a little bit confused.
Okay.
If you get a bullet stuck in your barrel, you're in a whole new world of
shit.
pain.
Yeah.
And that's just not a place you don't want to go. But very, very fast powders, pardon me, will often give you a greater flexibility in case volume fill rate with a relatively broad margin for error. But the slower the powder, the higher percentage of case fill you need
to create that pressure.
And if you somehow got the powder mixed up, or you got a squib load because in your powder thrower you didn't notice that only half the load went in because it got hung up, that's when you end up with the squib load detonation potential. And if you're running a slow powder in a big case capacity or a larger case capacity like a 300 Win Magnum, all of a sudden you've gone from a broad range of pressures that may be okay to oh dear.
Yeah.
A squib load with slow powders in big case capacities is not healthy, not a happy place to be.
Yeah.
So your burning rate and your case fill is critically important, and it's essential to know where you're starting from. Now, in our case, we use 5 programs to run on a simultaneous equation to calculate our starting point. This is stuff that's pretty much irrelevant to the customer, but it's a shortcut for us to develop our load development, and then we go and test it. And we confirm that it's that this window is so wide and it starts here and finishes there. And we test it across extraordinary ranges. We test it at 0 degrees, we test it at 40 degrees, just to make sure that there are no issues at either end. Obviously, the ultimate performance will be in the zone that we like to test in for ultimate accuracy, which is normally between 15 and 20 degrees. But that's only because it's a midpoint for here in this country.
Yeah.
But that load recommendation might be different to somebody hunting in North America or Canada or Alaska, because their conditions are quite different and their pressures need to be brought up to the same standard, but that would be with a completely different load, even using the same materials.
When you're doing your ladder test with your powder charge, what size charge weight jumps are you normally doing? Obviously, it's going to be different. If you're doing a Magnum versus something small, it's going to be different.
Yeah.
But are you normally jumping in 0.2 or are you going 0.1 grains as you...
No, well, basically, because our computer programming is extremely sophisticated, we normally have a very much narrower band to start and finish with. So whereas a reloading manual might start at, say, 45 grains of powder and finish at, say, 50 grains of powder, our recommendations might start at 46 and finish at 48. Yep. So it's a very much narrower band.
Because you've done that research on websites like Optimal Barrel Time and stuff like that, those sort of programs and things?
We run Quick Load, we run OBT, we also run 3 other programs, which are in a whole other world. And the objective in running a simultaneous equation is to get all the critical points to line up. Once those critical points line up, the window either side is generally very, very small. So the optimal result for minimum and maximum is generally 1.5, 2 grain apart. Yeah. And we go up in half grain increments in an average sort of case like a 308 or perhaps something a little bit larger at first, because the burning rate of powder from batch to batch with the powders that are commonly available to us, whilst they are extremely good, they do vary. And we need to calibrate the burning rate of the powder against the standard. And if it varies 2%, we can adjust it for that particular application, but we don't adjust it for general publication because their batch might be 2% the other way.
Yep.
So it still has to be within that, say, 2 grain band.
Yep.
But it's very unusual for it to step outside that. So we start that. That's a shortcut. We generally are able to get our product to shoot extremely well in less than 25 rounds in our testing. But we have to have that sophistication to get there because we don't have 2 or 3 days.
Yeah, the resources
for do absolutely every projectile in every cartridge option. Because you're going from 140 products to however many different cases and cartridges and wildcats and all the rest of it out there. And by the time you extrapolate all that out, you're going to go mad. Yeah. So we've got to get to it fairly quickly. Whereas a hunter or somebody who's involved in target shooting when only using 1 or 2 rifles doesn't need to spend the thousands of dollars on the tricky stuff and can go through the ladder testing. Or a lot of them will either be able to beg, borrow, steal a Labrator or a Magneto Speed or something along those lines, which will accelerate the process without having to spend silly amounts of money to get to the same result.
I got a question for you that's sort of on my mind is when it comes to an accuracy point of view, is case fill a very important topic as far as if you can have a load that has a slow burning powder, almost a complete case fill, so you're taking out variants, versus a load that doesn't have, it's a fast powder, there's less in the case, so the case could be lying on its side, the powder's sort of not, is case fill critical to accuracy, or have you seen that that's not so much the case?
There's been a number of examinations on that subject. For me, the jury is out. But some of the testing that I've seen seems to challenge that notion. and the faster the powder, the less important it appears to be.
Okay.
The only reason we get connected to or attached to case fill is not so much from an accuracy point of view, but from a safety point of view, particularly when you're going to the larger cases and slower powders.
Right.
All right. So
I like with my 6.5 Creed, I used 2209.
Yep.
I accidentally double charged a case the other day because I didn't move my funnel over to the next piece of brass. You can't actually double charge
it's
the
not
case
possible.
because it starts coming up the funnel and over the top. So then you go, oh, well, shit. Whereas if I was using something slower.
Faster.
Faster. Yeah. You double charge a case.
Well, probably not, because even in things like 22068, 8208 or 2208, you still couldn't get a double charge into the case. But you might be sitting at 88 or 90%, depending on the powder.
Yeah.
And if there's a difference in accuracy, I've yet to see the case for it.
Okay. Yeah.
The application of case fill we consider primarily from a safety perspective rather than accuracy perspective. And I'm not saying that it's completely invalid, but I haven't seen any evidence for it.
Mm-hmm. The running a shorter case, like a smaller case, like a lot of the BR-based stuff, or these, short magnums and whatever. So the idea then is the logic behind that not necessarily a case fill thing? It's a more an efficiency, like you're creating a more efficient boiler room, so you are burning that powder more in the case rather than down the barrel. Like what's the theory behind? Like you got a 300 Win Mag, which is like a long slender case, and then you got these short magnums, which is the same amount of case powder in there or close to, but in a lot shorter stack. The column's wider and it's not as long. Why are they making changes to that? What's the efficiency they're getting by doing that?
It's a bit of a Pandora's box, because there are the parameters outside of the case itself or the cartridge itself also at play, but we'll come back to that.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, a shorter, fatter one is theoretically more efficient. Sharper shoulder cases reduce brass flow, generally speaking. And yes, there is some validity to it, but some of the most amazing groups I think I've ever seen have been in old-fashioned cartridges and old-fashioned cases, which are still working very well today and extremely competitive.
Why don't you tell everyone what your favourite rifle is?
My favourite rifle is a Ruger No. 1, but my favourite cartridge is a 7B57.
Yeah.
and that cartridge has been around since 1893 and used by the military in Europe for a long time there and then, and it's still a very popular hunting cartridge around the world today. Is there anything special or magical about it? No. It's just it's that particular rifle and that particular cartridge is something that I'm really comfortable and confident in. But if somebody says, "Oh, I prefer the 308 or something else," I shrug my shoulders and say, "Yep, whatever."
Yeah. You're not fixed hard and fast.
No, I don't believe there's any magic in it. Yes, there are some basically sound engineering and technical issues as to why you would want to go down that way, but I think it's a little bit oversold marketing-wise. Okay. And one of the external parameters that I'll come back to now is that the firearms that are out there have 1, 2, 3, 4 basic, 5 if you stretch it, standard magazine lengths. So when they develop a cartridge, they're trying to make it fit a particular magazine. So it's one of the defining factors which influences
the end result.
The case and cartridge. And so if you are absolutely wedded to this idea that you've got to have a short action, then the only way that's going to happen is if you've got a short fat case, right? So that's a big part of the equation. And the other part of the equation is something that there was a discrepancy in the logic or the thinking between Europe and America. America had this view that they shoot long distances in big open country, and they had to drive the bullet as fast as possible to make it reach out as far as possible. So they put the biggest, longest case they could possibly fit inside a particular action or magazine. But that substantially reduced your ogive length and shape, which meant that you were trying to drive a short, stumpy, poor BC, low efficiency bullet at maximum velocity. And the Europeans went the other way. They tended to use a mid-range case length, allowing a much longer ogive and a much more efficient bullet shape, not driven quite so hard. And, you know, I don't want to get into America versus Europe, but it was a completely different ethos. And which one you prefer depends largely on, I think, where you came from.
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. Question's been on my mind because I'm looking at building a 6BR, and a lot of people are running quite long barrels on their 6BRs for PRS now to try and get a little bit of speed back to close the gap on those hotter 6BRs.
On the velocities, yep.
I couldn't figure out in my head how a tiny little BR case is still making speed, you're gaining speed in a 28-inch barrel, or even the bench guys maybe running 30, 31. Explain this to me. Does barrel length affect pressure, or is the longer barrel purely so your case can keep burning powder? Like does the powder completely burn in the case and then the bullet's set in motion? Or is the powder burning the entire time that the projectile is going down the barrel? And if you have a longer barrel, you're obviously giving it more time to gain more boost by burning more powder. In my head, I went, well, in a 28-inch barrel, I would have thought that BR would have burnt all its powder and then now be slowing down because it's got nothing else behind it pushing it. So I can't quite get my head around the logic of this. So maybe barrel length and pressure and velocities is a question for you to answer for me.
It's a case of diminishing returns. Right, there is a band at which extra barrel length will give you extra velocity, but the amount of powder burnt is hugely influenced by the speed of the powder burn itself, or the burn rate of the powder, right? Secondarily, by the length of the barrel. So if you've got an extremely fast burning powder, you can have complete combustion in a relatively short length. And in some of the slower burning powders, you might need a barrel 40 foot long to burn it all. I mean, that's obviously a ridiculous exaggeration, but you can. It is dependent on the amount of resistance that the bullet applies to the cartridge inside the barrel, the burning rate of the powder. So it's a bit of a how long is a piece of string question in that all of these things influence. Now, even if the powder is completely consumed, say 90% the way down the barrel, you still have this massive gas expansion behind it, still driving it forward.
Yep.
Now, obviously, if it was a 40-foot long barrel, the pressure would get to a point where it had diminished to the point where the bullet wouldn't even leave the barrel, because the frictional resistance would be too great for the amount of pressure behind it.
Yep.
So there is a feet per second rule of thumb that can be applied to an extra inch or an inch of barrel loss, but it still operates within a band. So if you're talking between, say, 20-inch and 30-inch, there's a rule of thumb that you can apply. But when you start going from 16 to 14, which is in most states illegal, the relationships and the ratios change.
Okay.
Right. So within the band and a rough rule of thumb, look, the guys that are going to 32-inch barrels using small capacity cases are really trying to wring the last foot per second of velocity gain out of it. But I tend to dismiss that as a worthwhile objective and try and match the nodal point to the barrel And that might mean docking an inch off the barrel or ordering a barrel that's 2 inches longer, just so that you can find the nodal point. More
Extrapolate on that, what you mean by nodal point of the barrel.
A nodal point is where the bullet leaves the barrel consistently.
Yep.
And consistency is foundational to accuracy, but they're not the same thing. Right? Now, the nodal point for a particular bullet and a particular charge will be different from bullet to bullet in a barrel.
And powder to powder too,
and
right?
Of course, and powder
Different
to
burn
powder.
rates, yeah.
So if you're looking for a nodal point, generally speaking, the shorter the barrel,
Yeah.
the gap between the nodal points
Yeah.
is smaller. So it's actually relatively easy or easier to tune a shorter barrel than it is a longer barrel.
Right.
Because the gap between the nodal points is further apart on a longer barrel. And the best way to consider that is a guitar string.
Mm-hmm.
If you watch a guitar string being plucked,
Vibrates.
you can see the sine wave that the string operates in. And the longer the string, the further the oscillation points are apart, right? And it's exactly the same with the barrel. The barrel is just a guitar string it's hollow and a bullet's passing up.
Yeah.
But there are a number of concussion waves. You've got the sine wave pattern, but it's elliptical because you've got rifling in there that's twisting the bullet.
Yeah.
So the sine wave is not vertical; it's elliptical.
Yeah.
But you've also got concussion forces running forward and back, and I think there's 4 different concussion waves. Yeah, right. And what you're trying to do is make sure that all of them come together at one particular point, so that when the bullet leaves, you get a consistent result. So that's a nodal point. Sometimes that means for your particular concoction that a slightly longer or a slightly shorter barrel would work. People are often reluctant to adjust their barrels, shall we say.
Yeah.
So the only way you can do that sensibly most of the time is to adjust your load so that you can either reach forward with higher pressure to get it to come to that gateway point, or back it off a little bit. Yep. So sometimes you'll find that a lower load will be far more accurate than a higher pressure load. And I'm far more interested in accuracy than I am velocity, right? So if somebody says to me, I'm getting 29.50 and I'm only getting 29.95, if I'm shooting 5-cent pieces and they're shooting basketballs, it doesn't really matter because it doesn't matter how fast a bullet's going if you're missing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? I would much rather have it right in the zone and hammering. And if that means going higher or lower in pressure, as long as it's within the safety band, I don't care. What's maximum velocity? There is a school of thought that the higher the better. But from my point of view, it doesn't really matter because if you know what the velocity is, you now know what the drop is going to be. And it's not a matter of, is it going to drop? Of course it's going to drop. Yeah. The issue is, do you know how much by?
Yeah. And is it going to do the same thing?
And is it going to be accurate? And obviously the accuracy objectives for a bench rest shooter as opposed to a PRS shooter as opposed to a game hunter are all going to be different and circumstance specific.
Is powder burn rate a topic to be discussed when you're talking about barrel life? So people talk about barrel life as far as pressure and as far as, how much powder is burnt. They talk about overbore, underbore. So, if you're burning a huge amount of powder, like in a smaller hole, that's obviously going to cause more wear. But I'm talking burn rate. So let's say I'm looking at running 2206H or 2208 or 2209 or something. Is that faster burning powder going to be hotter and wear the barrel out quicker or the lands out quicker than what the slower, colder powder will do?
I believe that there are more important issues at play than that.
Right.
Powder residue has a high carbon content, and carbon is foundational things like diamonds and carborundum and things like that. The issue is that carbon being a very, very hard and abrasive material, you want less of it, not more of it, sandpapering away on your throat.
Right.
Right?
So what you're saying is if you can burn more of it.
If you burn a faster powder, you will have, generally speaking, less carbon residue chewing away on your throat when you fire the next round.
Right.
Right? Because you're basically fire lapping your throat every time you fire a round. So ideally you want less carbon, not more carbon.
Right.
But that shouldn't be the determining factor, because the determining factor is the case capacity and the ideal powder for that, in that case, behind that bullet to give you the ultimate performance. And if you lose a little bit of barrel life because that was the ultimate
Performing powder,
then that's what you do. In my view, by far and away, the biggest challenge to barrel life is twofold. Is it or isn't it coated? Mm-hmm. Does it have a friction modifier in it? Friction modifiers have been assessed by people like Norma and demonstrate a clear advantage to throat wear. But even after that, I think the most important issue to barrel wear is how much ammunition you fire, how quickly.
Right, strings of fire, the way in which you fire.
So if you're cranking 20 rounds through in 2 minutes in a pig cull or something like that, you're going to do more damage to your barrel if you fired that same 20 rounds over 40 minutes.
Yeah.
Right? So I think that it's a valid question, but it's
the measurable difference in a hot powder versus a cold slow powder is on barrel life is so minuscule to too many other different things.
When you start, the thing of it is when you start looking at things like, say, a 6BR, your powder options are fairly limited.
Yeah.
And the amount of carbon left between
2206H and 2208
is so minuscule that I wouldn't even take it into consideration.
Right. Whichever one's shooting.
Whichever one works is the one you use.
Yeah.
And if a case is ideally suited to 2206H, you're not going to be putting 2225 in it.
No.
Because it's just ridiculous. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
Right? So whilst there's a difference there, it's not really an option.
So what you're saying is per caliber, the spectrum of what you can safely run is already very close together.
Yeah.
You can't run H1000 in a 6BR, like, you know.
It's not going Yeah.
So like the differences in those powders,
as stark as it is not really on the radar,
because you can't get them in that. You can't get that broader spread in each caliber.
And in a 300 normal, 2206H is going to send you to heaven quicker than the game you're aiming at.
Yeah, right. Okay, that's really interesting, because you see a lot of talk online about people talking about, this powder's nice and cold, and I got heaps of barrel life, and I've always thought, I don't know if there's any truth to that, but
the biggest issue, the other variable too is that it's very, very hard to make comparisons, because one barrel might wear better than another.
Yeah.
There are differences in barrel steels. There are differences in barrel manufacturing technology.
Yeah.
And
what was the difference in assembling it too? Whether your gunsmith did a good job or really, nicked things up with the reamer and made a bit of a mess in there, or whatever.
But a classic example would be a hammered forged barrel is very differently structured and harder than, say, a cut rifle barrel or a pull button barrel. And to say that I got brilliant life out of this barrel or not, you can't compare them, because they're not apples to apples. They're apples to oranges. And whether you go down the hammer forged or the cut rifle will come back to the cartridge choices you made and what barrel options are actually on the table.
Yeah. Let's lead into primers then, like primer selection. I know you've got a personal favourite. I'm glad we agree on it too, because it's the same for me. But talk about the differences in different primers and maybe different brands and what the differences are, but also like how you go about selecting the right primer for what you're shooting. You know, sometimes there's the option there to run a Magnum primer. We had some questions about people asking, you know, when do I run a Magnum primer and what is the difference between a Magnum primer and another primer? What's the difference between a match primer and a non-match primer? And which primer is going to work with my powder and things like that. So what's your take on those?
That's an extremely challenging question. It's a valid question. But I think the first place to start is with the powder manufacturer's recommendation for a particular cartridge.
Because most of them listed, don't they? All the books, it'll sort of have your minimum and max, and normally they'll say what primer they use to get those specs from. But
and whilst that's true, there just seems to be some magical partnerships, like a 210 or a 210M with 2208 and a 308 works really, really well. Of the 210 and 210M being a Federal product.
Federal matches, yeah.
And yet, in my 243, which is a very similar case but using a much faster, lighter pill, in my rifle, it won't shoot with a 210M. It will only shoot with a 215.
Okay.
And I have customers who've had exactly the opposite result. So there are some cartridges where it's Arthur or Martha.
Yep.
And it's really, really hard to know. But generally speaking, you would never use a 215 in, say, a 308. And why it happens to go that way on a 243, I'm not entirely sure.
Right.
I just note that those nuances occur. But, 308, 7B57, and a lot of the cartridges in that league are using reference 1 powder like 2209. Reference point 1 of 2209 means that anything faster than that, 2208, 2206H are faster than that. Mm-hmm. So that's the midpoint, and anything that's slower than that. That's faster or slower is centered around 2209.
Right.
Okay. So
in those cases.
Well, generally speaking anyway, the burn rate, that's pretty much universal. It does vary from case to case, yes, and by how much it varies, but the burn rate of a particular powder isn't actually measured in the case. It's another reference point.
Right, yeah.
That the powder manufacturers worry about, and I trust them to do it. They've got 3 PhDs running that gig, and I'm not going to pretend I know how they do that. But where I was going with that is that as a general rule, reference rate 2209-1 and faster, you use a standard primer. Mm-hmm. And when you start getting up into the big 30s and above, or 7mm rim mag, you'll often find a better result with a Magnum primer. Now, the difference between a Magnum and a standard primer is described in terms of brisance. And brisance is the intensity of the flame and the duration of the flame, which is used to ignite the powder. And a slow-burning powder needs a higher intensity ignition. Yep. A fast-burning powder doesn't need it.
Right.
And if you've got a high-intensity primer in a fast-burning powder, you're introducing a variable because you don't know exactly how much of that powder is going to get flashed from one to the other, but that variance diminishes with slow-burning powder. So you'll get a much better result with, say, a Magnum primer as opposed to a standard primer in the really big stuff like 300 Normas, 338 laps. And you may not have that result in a 375 H&H simply because you're going back to a faster powder.
Right. Okay.
So that's why I say always start with the powder manufacturer's recommendation and only vary it if you've got a strong case to adjust it.
Do primers change pressure? So like if you were to run let's say you ran a Magnum primer in just a 308 or a 6.5 Creed or something, is there disadvantages to running that Magnum primer? And can you run into changing pressure spikes and things like that?
Yes, you can. And as a general rule, that will happen, but it is not an absolute or universal. I've been surprised along those lines, but only occasionally.
Yeah.
Sometimes going to a more intense primer will sometimes drop the pressure, but you're talking 0.5% of the time. If you were going to go to the bank and put your life savings on it, you were going to say that a high-intensity Magnum primer is going to increase pressures.
Okay. Yeah. So basically what you're saying, if you don't need to be running it, there's not a huge advantage to going to it. Like if you
Correct. And the only reason you would need to is because you're running a large capacity case running slow burning powder.
Right. Yep. So, because I know it gets overwhelming for a lot of people. They're like, I've got to try and figure out what powder to use. I've got to figure out what projectile to use. Then I've got to figure out what the seating depth is and what the charge is. I know for myself, then primers was something I just didn't even want to look at when I was getting into reloading. I was like, there's too much going on. I'm going to buy a whole heap of a primer that I, did a bit of research, got a box of 1,000 federal gold medal matches, large rifle primers, and just went, I'm going to find a way to make these work. As a general rule of thumb, is a load is not really going to be defined by a primer. So like if the difference between a Federal 205 and a CCI 450, right? The difference is what I'm kind of getting at is there going to be a point where you go, couldn't get this load to shoot, and the reason was you just needed to switch primers? Or very rarely, like if you've done your seating depth test to a very good degree and you've done your ladder test with your powder charge to a very good degree, the swapping of a different brand of primer
can make a difference, but the difference, it certainly can make a difference, but the difference in terms of importance comes down to the application. You might get an improvement of 2, 3 or 4 mil of dispersion.
Yep.
Which is critical for a bench rester, but to a hunter it's irrelevant, right? So is there a point in going down that path? Well, sometimes there is, and sometimes you have no choice.
Yeah, what's
but
available.
Especially in the current market when your primer or whatever of choice is just not available, and now you have to look at what is available and see what can be adapted. So as a general rule of thumb, what I find is that whatever the reason is, whether the thickness of material or hardness of material or anything else, CCIs and Prime and Federal are made in the same factory, but they don't behave the same way. And why, you'd have to go back to them and ask. But I do note that, and my preference for Federal is simply because they seem to show pressure signs before the CCIs and other brands.
And that's because they're softer.
Well, they just seem to show sign of distortion more quickly than some other primers.
Which is advantageous.
In my case, I want the primer to tell me that I've got pressure issues before something else. Like I don't want to see head separation or case bulging or massive case swipe or other issues. I want to see that I want the primer to tell me that there's an issue first.
When you're arriving,
and
pressure.
Does that mean there's anything wrong with the CCI primers or the Wolf or the RWS? Not at all. Not at all. But what it does mean is that you now got to look for other issues of pressure at the same time or independently of to make sure you're still within the safe limits.
Yeah.
And I just simply prefer to use the Federals because it tells me first. Other people go and measure their cases with micrometers and all the rest of it, but to me that's a little silly because that'll all come down to the tolerance of your chamber. And if you've got a sloppy chamber, that's not at all helpful. Yeah.
Maybe let's run through some of I'd be interested to hear some of the gear that you use to reload. What press? You'd have a huge range of presses, I imagine, for the amount of different stuff you're testing. But for your personal rifles that you shoot with, either hunting or target, I'm interested to hear what press you're running, what dies you're running, and just a little bit about your process and on what your brass prep. I know you're big on the primer pocket cleaning.
Yeah. Well, basically, I have 4. I had 5. I've now got 4 presses, and they're all different. They're all, when I say all different, they're all different brands, but they're all O presses. And yeah, there are coax, and there's a whole bunch of other different styles of presses. Even though there are some significant advantages in going to other styles of press, the O press has never failed me, and they're producing results that are more than acceptable. And I'm of the school: if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I've got plenty of products that are producing EOSs and SDs that are all single digit, great accuracy. And I'm sitting back and thinking, well, I want $1,000 press to improve on what? And I can't see the case for it most of the time. And for the guys that are out there that are using high value, high precision loads that are using, forces et al. Yeah. Happy days. Good luck to you. But for more than 80% of my loads, I'm just using a Hornady lock and load.
Yeah.
But I do use others. It's just that's
what works.
It works for me. My die settings are all set. In it goes, snap on. I do check it at the beginning and during to make sure that there hasn't been any shift in some way, shape or form. But it's really quick, it's really easy, and it's producing results that are more than acceptable.
Do you run, for your resizing, do you normally run bushing dies, or are you happy just to run standard?
I only run bushing dies in specialty gear, not my hunting gear. I run bushing dies for things like the 300 Norma, but we're seeking a higher level precision over much longer distances. It's one of those things where is what's important. And most hunting rifles have an application of no more than about 400 metres, and many of them much shorter than that. And bushing dies and all the fancy gear and measuring to 0.02 of a grain of powder and all the rest of it at 400 metres is a bit ridiculous.
Yeah.
And for most of the guys that are hunting at no more than 200 metres, it's just like, what?
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah.
So I'm finding that even though on the bullet side of the equation, Hornady are a competitor, I have no qualms or problems about using their presses and some of their gear, because it's producing a more than acceptable result.
Yep. Do you use an expander mandrel to set neck tension?
Yeah. Well,
on some of the
on some of them, and I just use an ordinary expander button for the hunting cartridges.
Yep.
The trick is, or the objective is to minimise your work hardening or the malleability of the brass. But there also comes a point too that if you're doing big numbers, the speed of the process becomes part of the equation. And when's it got to be done by and all of that kind of stuff. And despite the fact that it's probably at the more primitive end of the equation, if it's working, why change it?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. How about throwing powder? Are you beam scale, you use electronic throwers?
I used beam scales probably for 30 years, and I bypassed the intermediate electronic stuff. And when I went from beam scales, I went straight to the A&Ds. And that's mostly because we're doing so much loading and doing so much testing and all the rest of it. Time is important. And the A&D process just throws really accurate charges to very tight tolerances very much more quickly.
That's the A&D auto trickler setup?
The whole routine. Yeah. The A&D of the scales and the auto trickler is obviously
the powder and the trickler. The thrower
is a separate scenario. But we do that simply because it just saves so much time. But if you've got one cartridge and you're only loading 20, 50 rounds and you're doing that every 6 or 12 months, there's absolutely no need to spend that kind of money. It's not necessary. And you can get I fail to see the field performance difference for 100 at 200 metres in going between those two extremes.
Yep. Yeah, totally. Do you have a specific brass prep process? Probably it's going to vary from your match stuff or your long range stuff to your hunting stuff.
Yep.
Is annealing in that process, and what are you doing for cleaning as well?
Well, I know that Plushy likes to anneal everything.
Yep.
And I understand his case for it. And when you look at his results and when you look at his case life, it's really hard to argue and say that he's not doing a great job. Right? But I don't do it that way because I'm not firing the same volume of the one case all the time. I'm using a very much broader spectrum because of the work that we do. So I tend to fall back on the principle that was explained in applied ballistics, where they tested the performance results of brass from brand new to second firing, third firing, fourth, blah, blah, blah. And in the example provided, the most consistent was on firing number 3, and then it started to go downhill. So my view...
And this was without annealing? This was just...
Yeah, without annealing.
Yeah.
But once it gets to firing number 3, that's when you start annealing.
Yep.
Right. So that's just...
In your...
that's just a personal view, and that's based on the research that's been done, limited as it is, and quite anecdotal. I haven't seen anything to suggest that I need to do more work because the results we're getting are great, so why take on work you don't need to? But then unlike Simon, I'm not trying to get 28 reloads out of one particular case.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of sort of divergence. You know, he's got a slightly different objective to myself in that one.
Yeah.
But is annealing important? Yes, but I wouldn't do it in the first 3 firings. After that, because after the first 3 firings, the case is now fully expanded and matched to your chamber, and hopefully your dies are too.
Yep.
And now you've got a consistency there that doesn't need to be manipulated, and all you need to do is make sure that it feeds again by full length sizing it, and then anneal.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, we might start to wrap this one up. Is there anything that you feel like you wanted to add in that we haven't covered?
I think it's important to do identify the discrepancies between neck sizing and full length sizing.
Yep.
Some of the bench resters tend to love the idea of neck sizing only. Just about everybody else may start with neck sizing only, but almost universally end up on full length resizing because chambering the cartridge is far more important.
Yeah, than saving some brass life or
what have you. But the other thing too is that in whether it's a PRS style thing, a stuck case is there goes your comp.
Yeah.
And in a hunting situation,
there goes your hunt.
There goes your hunt. So feed reliability is a higher level priority. Yeah. And the other thing too is that those chambers tend to be operating in dirtier environments and tend to require different tolerances.
A bit more leeway with your tolerance,
So we've got to be careful that whether it's PRS or long range or hunting application, the principles that apply there are not bench rest. Now, everybody seems to want to get this one bullet hole tack driving accuracy out of their hunting rifle, which costs them $600, and want to compare it to a $10,000 or $20,000 bench rest rifle, and aren't happy until that happens, and burn out barrels in the process trying. So it's just a question of matching objectives and keeping it real.
Yeah, I think that whole neck sizing versus full length sizing thing I've seen it's almost pretty gone now. Like I think it's changed. Like even the bench rest guys as well. They're willing to go full length size. Why would I not? But you can still get that accuracy. It's not necessarily robbing any accuracy.
And many people start neck sizing only, believing it's the way to go, but very few stay there.
Yeah. No, that's good, mate. Well, thanks for coming on again. I'm sure we'll do another one. But it's been awesome having you, mate. I've got a lot of things to take away from that. My brain is tired from taking on information. So we'll wrap it up. Thank you, mate. Thanks again to Projectile Warehouse for making these podcasts possible. Thanks, Steve Hurt from Outer Edge Projectiles for coming on. And please, guys, go have a look at his stuff. If copper projectiles is something that you've never considered before, give it a consideration. Have a look into it, see if it's going to fit your application, and challenge people to try it. I know I'm going to try it in both a hunting and a target capacity, so I'm keen to see how the results go there. There's already people using it that I respect, and so I'm excited to have a go. So Outer Edge Projectiles, Steve Hurt, thank you very much.
I've blown one shot, so
Yeah. Impact, yeah.
I'm not concerned about that.